This reconstruction of a French hood was made in the style worn in a portrait from about 1540, painted by Hans Holbein. It has been worked according to my theory that the iconic French hood is more than just one piece, and that it is actually an assembly of 3 pieces on top of each other. My theory is presented in Medieval Clothing and Textiles Volume 13, published in 2017, and here you will also find the patterns used for all 3 layers of this French hood. The top piece is a black velvet hood with a satin facing and a filament, which is in this case a string of rather large gold beads. The styling of the black hood is basically done by pinning, and the ends of the panel are here pinned to the edge of the bag to match the portrait in question, but the ends could be left to drop like this, or they could be pulled back to be pinned to the bag closer to its centre behind the head. The black hood is held in place by pins sitting in the bottom fold of the set folding at either side of the face and at the top, and the pins are tying the black hood to the layer below. Under the black hood is an aureate, which is a coif that covers the ears, and its visible part is a brim of silk satin. It has got another filament of smaller gold beads and a cloth of gold pleated edge, both sitting at the front of the brim. The aureate is also held in place by pins tying it to the bottom layer. 3 pins are sitting in the headband, 2 of them at the sides of the face and a 3rd one at the top, and the ends of the brim are pinned to the straps going under the chin. At the bottom we have a basic coif, which is held in place by just the 1 pin holding the straps together under the chin. Each of the 3 layers works in the way that it can be laid out flat, as opposed to needing a special case for storage or travelling. The inner coif goes flat and the aureate goes flat, and the black hood goes flat as well for storage. The materials used are linen interlining, which is quite soft, and buckram, a rigid material for stiffening. You need bias tape and millinery wire and a thread to match. We have white linen, preferably as fine as you can come by, white silk satin and white thread to match. We have black velvet, but as this is a nightmare for the camera, we're using blue velvet instead for showing the details. The black silk satin is also replaced with blue to show the tailoring, and there is thread to match. We have cloth of gold ribbon for the pleated crepin in the front of the aureate, and last but not least, a whole lot of flat bottom gold beads in 2 sizes. The tools you want are a pair of scissors, pins, needles, a thimble, a steam iron, a stiff brush, which is for pressing the velvet, a tea towel, also for pressing, a pleating board made from pasteboard, and nippers for the millinery wire. We start from within and look first at the coif. The 2 parts of the bag are assembled with a French seam at the back. The straps are folded, the seam allowance folded in, and they are inserted into the end seams of the brim, and then the brim and the bag are both sewn to the headband. The front edge of the coif should sit on the very top of the head, and it is kept close by the straps going under the chin, where they are held together by just the 1 pin. Now we turn to the aureate and start with the brim, or rather the interlining of the brim. The buckram and the linen interlining are cut on the bias without seam allowance, and the 2 layers are joined using an invisible pad stitch. When this is done with the matching thread, the stitch is very difficult to see on one side and actually invisible on the other. And what's equally important is that you can't feel the stitch either, as it would otherwise show through the satin. I'll show you how it's done using the black thread. On the linen interlining you go over only one thread, leaving just a tiny dot, and on the buckram you let the long part of the stitch follow the direction of the weaving very carefully. Once the invisible pad stitching is finished, you add the markings from the pattern, they're here done in green, and you do 2 rows of a running stitch going between the markings H and G, plus the markings I and J, they're here done in red. Leave long ends at both start and finish. This is to help gathering the buckram. Now we have to stretch the interlining. The markings in the pattern will tell you where the stretching begins. Put the iron on top heat and full steam, and keep the linen interlining facing up at all the times, otherwise you will spend the rest of the day cleaning your iron. To stretch the brim, you first fill it with steam by ironing it over, and now the buckram is soft as butter and ready to be shaped. The centre part is first stretched a bit between the markings B and E, and from there you stretch it in a circular movement. Gather the other side by means of the running stitch. When the buckram is heated up with steam, it's extremely flexible and can be shaped very easily, and once it has cooled off it will hold its new shape. The Renaissance way would, for lack of a steam iron, have been to soak the buckram and nail it to a wooden board where the wanted shape would have been drawn up, and then it would be left there to dry. The pattern shows you the outline of the finished shape. Be careful to let it cool off completely before working it any further. The ends of the threads are now pulled to the buckram side, and here they're tied to secure the gathering. The millinery wire is to go on a piece of bias tape. First, the ends of the wire are secured by a sharp bend, and then it goes into a fold of the bias tape, and you keep it there with a whip stitch. The ends of the tape are folded up to cover the ends of the wire. The bias tape and the millinery wire act as a support for the front of the aureate. A piece of bias tape goes on the buckram side from the markings B and C to the tips. The bias tape is cut at the corners to make it flatter. I use an invisible running stitch which goes over only one thread on the linen interlining. And after that the bias tape holding the millinery wire is sewn onto the front of the aureate on the buckram side using the same invisible running stitch as before. The white satin is cut from the same pattern as the linen interlining and the buckram, but this time with a seam allowance added all the way round. Pin the satin to the linen interlining and turn over the seam allowance with a herringbone stitch, going into the bias tape all the way round, except between the markings B and C. The lining of the brim is made of linen, and it is also cut with a seam allowance which is folded in before the lining is pinned to the seam allowance of the satin, and again you leave out the piece between the 2 markings B and C. After that the lining is sewn down using an invisible top stitch. The back of the aureate is also made of linen, and as it is only one layer of fabric, I've used a French seam centre back to get a nice finish on the inside. Add the headband. Now pull the seam allowance of the brim out between the 2 markings and gather the satin and the linen right next to the edge of the interlining with a little running stitch. Join the brim to the bag and the headband with all the seam allowance going into the headband, and you do this with an invisible top stitch. Now is a good time to do the crepin, which is the pleated cloth of gold ribbon at the front of the brim. The ends of the ribbon have been folded up twice and hemmed, and the ribbon has been tacked to the pleating board. Pull the threads to gather the pleats and make sure that they are neatly tucked into the folds of the pleating board. To secure the tightness, I'll put 2 pins and I'll do a figure 8 around a pin with each thread one at a time. Place the tea towel on top of the pleating board and iron it with a steam iron at maximum heat. Do it thoroughly and leave it to cool off before you undo the tacking and remove the ribbon from the pleating board. The smaller beads are gathered like a string of pearls to form a filament. Sew the filament onto the front of the aureate using a whip stitch between the beads, going over the string and through all the layers of fabric and interlining. The crepin is the last thing to go on, as it would probably be the one thing which wanted to be replaced more often, as the pleating might want to be redone from time to time. Place the crepin on the lining and sew it on with a whip stitch. The whip stitch sits in the bottom of each fold of the pleating, and here I've done a few stitches in a contrasting colour to show how the stitch goes. The headband of the aureate goes on top of the headband of the coif, and the pinning is done. Turning to the black hood, we start with the panel. The buckram is placed on top of the linen interlining in the position indicated on the pattern, and the two are joined using the invisible pad stitch. Between the markings B and D I have done 2 rows in a running stitch to support the gathering. The set folding of this panel is very much the core of this reconstruction theory. Put the iron on maximum heat and full steam, and fold the linen interlining back over the buckram along the straight edge and extend this fold to both ends of the panel. Then you turn the panel over and fold the linen interlining the opposite way along the curved edge of the buckram. Take your time to do this. Tighten the threads of the running stitch a bit to bring down the linen interlining without any unwanted pleats. And press again. And now it's time for stretching again. Remember to keep the linen interlining facing up at all times. Start from the middle and go outwards. Fill the materials with steam, press down hard and stretch the panel slightly with a circular movement over the same area where the gathering was necessary. After that, leave it to cool off and it will keep this shape. Secure the ends of the running stitch by tying a knot either end. The edge of the linen interlining is covered with bias tape along all 4 sides except between the markings B and E. Gently stretch the linen interlining to the bias tape between markings B and C plus D and E. The satin is placed on the linen interlining, leaving what seems to be 2 little seam allowance at the top. No more than 2 centimeters of satin should go above the top fold at the center. Now the satin is stitched along both folds, following the edges of the buckram. Use a tiny running stitch going into the linen interlining. Tack the ends of the satin to the interlining about 4 centimeters from the edges. The velvet of the panel has been cut in 2 pieces and sewn together at the centre. Use the brush and the tea towel for pressing the seam, and make sure that the pile of the velvet is pointing upwards to get the deepest colour. Place the velvet on the bottom side, leaving 2 centimetres of seam allowance at the top between the markings B and D. Pin the velvet to cover the whole panel. Fold over the seam allowance and sew it to the interlining with a herringbone stitch all the way around except between markings D and H. And the herringbone stitch should go deep enough to just catch the velvet on the outside. The corners are done with a lacing stitch for the best finish. The seam allowance of the satin lining is folded up and sewn to the velvet with an invisible top stitch, leaving out the area between markings G and H. To keep the bottom fold of the panel as sharp as possible, the velvet cannot come all the way out into the fold, as it would be too bulky. So the velvet is pulled back 1 centimetre too far between the markings G and H to make it both thinner and sharper, and in this position the velvet is sewn on the linen interlining 1 centimetre below the bottom fold. This should leave 1 centimetre of seam allowance on both the velvet and the satin between the markings G and H. Now we turn to the fall. Place the satin flat out on top of the velvet, wrong side against wrong side, and tack the 2 fabrics together 4 centimetres from the edge. The seam allowance of the velvet is folded over and tacked at the bottom and of the 2 sides. Keep the knots on the thread on the outside of the velvet, otherwise you can't get to them later. Fold the seam allowance of the satin a few millimetres from the edge of the velvet and stitch it using an invisible top stitch. While stitching, the needle has got to go deep enough to just catch the outside of the velvet, and this will keep the edge well defined. At the top, the fall is folded into pleats according to the markings in the pattern, and the pleats are pinned securely for now. This version of the bag is a bowl shape, and it's made from velvet. It's sewn centre back, and the seam is pressed using the brush. As no audience will ever get to see the lining of the bag, this is made from linen. The pleats are adjusted at the top by folding the top over, which gives you exactly how much each layer of the pleating will dislocate itself in order for the fall to hang beautifully down the lady's back. The pleated fall is placed on top of the velvet part of the bag and pinned or tacked into place. Then the panel comes on top of the fall and the bag. The 3 items are joined using a back stitch all the way between the markings G and H. As a final and quite important touch, all the seam allowance from the panel, the fall and the bag is to be forced backwards into the bag. I pin it and I do a running stitch through the bag and all the seam allowance. Now the lining can go on with an invisible top stitch all the way along the edge of the bag. The beads of the upper billament are gathered like a string of pearls and fastened on the edge of the panel, just like it was done on the aureate. The velvet hood is ready to go on top of the aureate and to be pinned first at the top and then at the sides, and the fall is neatly arranged to fall down the lady's back.